Welcome to episode 6, the Inside Line podcast presented by Thor. I'm this week's host, Michael Lindsay, and this week's guest is Ross Maeda. Now, admittedly, I thought this podcast would be a little bit easier to do because for me, Ross is a mentor, a prior boss, and even in times in my life, basically a second dad. This also made it actually harder to pinpoint what to chat with him about because I know enough about his life, his work, his family, that this could easily turn into way too long of a podcast. So I decided to give people a broad overview of what it was like for him going from racer to early test rider and technician, talking about some of the riders he got to work with, hearing a couple good stories, and hearing about the differences in components, and even how it was kind of for a guy in his position as that technician from the late 70s into the 80s and 90s, you know, the way they interacted with teams and riders and how much those relationships changed. Hopefully this gives, you know, some people a fun little broad overview of that earlier to mid generation of our past motocross history. But before we jump into this, we like to thank the people that make this happen. Celebrating 50 years of racing heritage, the first, the forever, Thor Motocross. They are the presenting sponsor of this podcast. We really thank them for supporting us. And also, Chaparral Motorsports has been helping riders outfit their dirt bikes for more than 30 years. Today, Shap Moto offers professional advice online and in store, helping you find the best riding gear, parts, accessories, and tires for all your power sports vehicles. Visit shapmoto.com today. Hope you all enjoy the conversation. Let us know, of course, what you think about it. Any comment or feedback is greatly appreciated. So enjoy this conversation with KYB and now, of course, Enzo Racing's Ross Maeda. So wait, have you ever actually been to a mud race in Japan?
Well, I raced some mud races when I went over there. It was like fucking, I could barely get around the track.
How'd you get suckered into that?
I went there to race when I was 16.
Oh, okay.
It was pouring, and I was like, no, canceled, huh? No. You're gonna race in there. I remember I was in a Japanese car, and we were just waiting for my friend to show up, and I just started pushing buttons in there, and the windshield wipers went on. They went, and I started laughing. I was like, fuck. What's wrong with your windshield wipers? And they go, that's high. And I'm like, can't even see through that. And then when it started raining, I knew why. It was just
oh, my word. Oh. So I was thinking about this the other day, thinking about just anyone in the industry, whether it be riders, techs, guys that have, I don't want to say seen it all, but somebody that's been through it with so many different teams, athletes, so many different eras, and say you've definitely seen quite a bit of it, but how the heck do you even get started in something like this? I imagine like most of us, you grow up riding motocross, but at what point did you get pulled into the suspension side and the racing side started to take a back seat to it?
Well, I was a racer originally and just wanted to work in the motorcycle industry, and the first thing that I was ever offered was I knew some Japanese people that were here in the motorcycle industry, and they offered me a job, possibly to be a mechanic at Team Suzuki before it was really national racing was really what it is at this point now. And that was originally the first offer to do something in the industry, but they told me I had to quit riding, and that was out of the question, so I gave up on that. And then the next thing that came up is they said I could get a job test riding for KYB, and that's where it all started as far as industry stuff.
So that was Aki that set you up with that job, right?
Yeah, Aki was working at Suzuki then. He was actually, I guess, was kind of like chief mechanic and kind of team coordinator before really there was a title of team manager, and Aki just was the go-to guy for everything, and he's the one that offered me the job to work as a mechanic. And I didn't even know if I was qualified, but he told me I knew enough that I could do that job. And he's the one also that got me the job at KYB.
Now, in that situation, is it like, I think a lot of people in the industry, that if they get out racing, somebody is either a lifelong friend or a family friend. How long had you known him at that point? Was he somebody that helped you quite a bit before in racing, or somebody you just met at the track? Or
we met him at the track, and the reason why, possibly we met him and gravitated towards him was he was in California with a Japanese professional rider that was in California racing local pro events, and he was this rider's mechanic, and we just had assumed that he had come to U.S. with him, but in fact he was already here, and they just met up at the races, and he ended up becoming his mechanic, even though Aki was riding and racing too.
What year was it that all?
Oh, that was like the late 60s, like 68, 69.
So first thing you basically did with KYB, was it as simple as go see if you can break this? They actually bring you in the shop and actually teach anything about it, or was it just the more simple of go out, ride us, tell us what you think, come back?
Well, first of all, when I said it was late 60s, that's when I met Aki, and I was like 14 years old. But I didn't start working for KYB until I was 20, and I was originally hired as only strictly a test rider and kind of a shop flunky. And so when I first started working for them, there was only one engineer and me, and the first few things that I remember testing, it was like probably pre-production components or even factory components, and everything I rode was really good compared to what I was used to. So I was always saying, oh, this is really good. And so my boss realized at that point in time that I didn't have a very sophisticated palate for suspension, so the next thing he did was order me factory suspension components. So from that point on, everything I felt was worse than that. So he kind of educated me first.
That was one of the first things I got spoiled seeing around your shop, is being able to see a little bit of the difference between production and work stuff. And nowadays, I think we say it all the time in articles and anything media, we always talk about how much closer the components are that the guys are racing to what you actually get production. But back then, how big of a difference or a gap was it, like you said, the work stuff you got to play with versus the production stuff? Was it pretty massive? Or?
Oh, yeah. Back in the 70s, what I think a big part of it was production department and racing department was completely separate. So very little works technology trickled into production bikes at that time. But also, that was the era of factory works bikes. So the race bikes prepared for the racers were handmade factory bikes, and everything was super light and no expense spared for a part that was cast or forged on a production bike would have been machined billet, magnesium or aluminum on a factory bike.
How many years did you do that before you actually finally got to the point that, or how far into the job before you were actually allowed to get into anything? And what was really brought to that point? Did they finally was it a natural progression, like, okay, he's been testing long enough, you should get into this? Or was it just something all of a sudden one day it was just you got hustled into? Or
well, in my case, it was kind of an evolution, because when I first started, production and even works components to a degree were built at the factory and basically sealed. You couldn't take them apart. And so in the case of the factory parts, there would be shock setting A, B, C or something, and that was all we worked with. And it wasn't until probably 2 or 3 years that I was there that they started having components that were disassemblable and adjustable. So I would say probably the first 5 years was a very fast evolution, where they went from sealed units to rebuildable units, but that was strictly in the factory stuff. The production stuff was still all sealed and you couldn't take it apart until, I would say, the single shock stuff started coming out. I believe work stuff was, you could take it apart and revalve it, but production components, I would say even on the Suzuki RMs, which was the cutting edge for production bikes, those rear shock components were sealed. You couldn't open them.
So coming to a racing situation when you first started actually going to factory races, I mean, how did, you see guys anymore, they either have multiple settings, different forks built on the truck, tons of clickers you can change. What did you basically do at a race? And if a rider came in and complained about something, did you just have a whole different shock to throw on, or did most of them just get over it and ride for them?
Well, obviously back then, the riders weren't nearly as picky, but also you had generally gone, the same now, you don't just show up at the race with a bike you've never ridden. You go through a testing process before, so by the time they got to the races, they pretty much knew what their bike was like, and they just dealt with it on the track. If thing felt weird because the track was a lot different, they just relied on their riding ability to deal with that. There wasn't riders coming in screaming that the bike was impossible to ride. There was none of that.
So timeline wise for you, what really happened first? More getting involved on the technical side when you guys actually got to the point you could tear into suspension, or did you start going to the races first as a feedback / technician to an actual, like what the early days of the nationals were and stuff like that?
Well, for me, I was so interested in suspension once I really learned about construction and what was going on and function. I took a personal interest, and I basically would take apart anything I could get my hands on and just study it and ask a million questions and stuff like that. But I want to say I was probably there for a year or two, and then they sent me to Japan for it was about a month for training, and a lot of the stuff that they went through I had already been taught by my boss in California, but I also was taught how to work on the dyno and a lot of the bench testing machines and stuff like that. So it was that as well as testing. So it was I would say by the second, third year I was there, I was already tearing into stuff and working on it, which, I mean, nowadays you would be taught immediately to do that. But when I first started, it was like people, even the engineers weren't doing that. They were building it from scratch and sealing it up and sending us sealed components. So, to answer your question, it was kind of an evolution of just being there. I started working on the internals and learning how to valve stuff, I would say within 2-3 years.
So what was early race support like for you guys? Because I know you look at a team now, and teams have, some of the biggest teams have their own suspension or / chassis in-house engineer, and then there's also a representative from either KYB or Showa that is also assigned to that team, and they're only assigned to 1 or 2 riders. Some of the lights teams a little more, but I can't imagine the manpower was that high in the early days. Like when with KYB, was it all of the Suzuki teams you'd go tend to the races, or what was it kind of like for support level?
Well, first of all, in the the late 70s and 80s and stuff, motocross, professional motocross racing, there were 4 factory teams, 4 Japanese factory teams, and those factory teams were racing equipment that was built by each factory. Whatever suspension company that particular team decided to use for production was usually KYB or Showa was obligated to that team to provide works level racing components and stuff like that. So when I was there, Yamaha, Kawasaki, and Suzuki all used KYB components. Honda was the only team that Showa supported. So actually, in theory, I was supposed to support Suzuki, Kawasaki, and Yamaha, but I was working with Suzuki the closest with production and factory support. So all the race support, I would go and I would be responsible for all the racing components for all the riders. Yamaha, at the time, they were using KYB components, but at the time, the production Yamaha component was actually produced by a small suspension company that was owned by Yamaha, and it was called Soki. And so we really had nothing to do with their rear shocks, the monoshock stuff, but they were using KYB forks. But they would request my support for production tests, but factory tests, they very rarely asked for our help. They were always kind of doing it in-house. Like, it was really funny, but as I remember, Yamaha factory mechanics were responsible for servicing their forks and shocks themselves. And Kawasaki was kind of in the same boat. We were helping them a little, but there was, it wasn't like at the races people were like doing that much specific suspension testing. I mean, really, Suzuki kind of was, because I was there, but I think Yamaha was doing it on their own, and they were kind of limited to what they could do. And same thing with Kawasaki in the early days.
Would you say with Yamaha that even almost carries over a little bit to modern day, how they treat testing and setting up their bikes? Because I look at how involved like Butler, Preston are when we talk about how much internal testing those guys do here, albeit of course they work with KYB, they buy their components, but would you say they've always had a little bit of a mindset where they work a little more internally on certain stuff like that with production? Or
the Yamaha's evolution of what they were doing, they, like I said, they did a lot of stuff with that Soki company, and then for some reason they got really heavily involved with O'Lean's, and I think they even bought a part of O'Lean's. So there was a period in the 80s where Yamaha was, they were using O'Lean's on their factory bikes and stuff, and I don't know what the political situation was there, but we rarely got called to support them for anything for racing. It was all production I was involved with.
So first going to the races, who were some of the riders you first connected with, worked with, that you were tending to?
When I first started at KYB, the riders that were riding for Team Suzuki that I first started working with was like Kent Howerton and Danny Laporte, and Daryl Schultz came a little bit later, but it was all that early 80s, late 70s group of guys that I worked with, mostly for racing. For some of the other teams with Kawasaki or Yamaha, I would do just very, very little, just whenever they would need something. But that was the first group I would say that I was involved with, was like Team Suzuki in that era of Danny Laporte and Kent Howerton, Brian Myerscough, and later Mark Barnett.
So the days of Suzuki, I'm thinking off the top of my head when Roger got more into developing all the things he did. I remember you told me a funny story before, you've kind of touched on it, is amongst everybody I've seen you talk to, meet with, I've never seen you fanboy, but I have heard you say that the first time you met Roger was a bit of a freak out moment on your part.
Well, of course it was, that's kind of an age thing, because it's pretty hard to get excited about a 16-year-old kid when you're 28 years old or something. But when I started, I was 20, and Roger was my idol, like everybody else. And I did get to work with him when I first started there. So I was just, kind of starstruck working with him. But also, there was a big difference then, because riders, and even back then, I think it was more so European riders than American riders. European riders were just more well versed in development, because I think Roger came from CZ, and at CZ you had to scrounge for this shock and that pair of handlebars and everything else like that, and if they wanted to change something on the bike, they had to do it themselves. So when Roger was at Suzuki and they would be testing, Roger would be dictating like what he wanted the suspension components to be like, and I'd never worked with a rider that could give me that kind of information. But also he was at the level where he could explain to the engineers that the swing arm needed to be more rigid, or he needed a different head angle, or he needed different offset on different things. He was very well versed in chassis theory and stuff like that, and there were no American riders at the time that I knew of or ever worked around that could make judgment calls like that. So he was pretty easy to be impressed with.
As you say at the time, I mean, when you look back at other than technicians that taught you a lot, would you say Roger, from the sense of a rider, taught you basically more than anyone else did in a sense, or?
Well, the difference was back then, all I could really do was listen to riders' comments and use my own judgment call to interpret what he was saying into what needed to be done. And I was pretty inexperienced at the time, so I think back at, how my mindset changed, but learning what changed what. Well, a big part of that was when I learned how to work on the dyno, and then in turn I started to learn how to change the valving to get what I wanted on the dyno. there was, I remember being very naive, thinking, okay, I've got this box full of valve parts and I've got a dyno. I'm going to do every conceivable configuration of the valving and dyno it and catalog it all, which was naive to think I could do that, but it was something that I thought I could do. But in reality, if I had done something that stupid, I would have spent a year logging settings that weren't even feasible to use. It was more learning what worked, learning what that looks like on the dyno, and learning how big a change or how little a change the rider can feel, where, what speed, that type of thing. So that was a huge learning experience that tended to change your opinion and direction the whole time you're doing it, because from day to day I would learn something and think, I'm really smart. And then I do something in a couple days and go, everything I thought before is a lie. That was useless. So, it's a very, very big learning curve. And for sure, I considered the stuff I learned valuable, but a lot of times it was like, well, all that stuff I learned is stuff that doesn't work.
With the dyno, were you ever surprised how many times you would when it would come up, something you would try on a dyno that would make a massive reading difference, and then you would try it with a rider and they'd be like, what'd you change? And then vice versa, something on a dyno that doesn't pop up, but a rider would be like, fixed everything.
Well, again, that I think one of the biggest moments for me of learning something was I was riding, testing at Saddleback, and I had gone down a fast downhill section, and at the bottom the suspension G'd out really bad and bottomed and sprung up, and my legs flew off the pegs and everything, and I thought, I need more rebound dampening. And so I went back to the shop and dynoed the shock, and then made a few changes and dynoed them and said, okay, that's about 10% more rebound. And then I went out and rode it again, and it felt the same. And I thought, I'm going to have to make a much bigger change. And I went through that about 3 or 4 times, and I made what I thought were huge changes, and it felt completely the same when I rode it. So I got impatient, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to take a nitrogen tank out to the track and just valve it in the back of my truck until it's right, and then I'll bring it back and dyno it. And the first thing that I learned was I was making it have so much rebound that it would still bottom and blow my feet off the pegs, but the tire would still be up in the fender and it would have way too much dampening. And then I realized that it was compression dampening that was too soft. It wasn't the rebound. I was hitting this dip and I was going down too fast, and that's why it was going down, bottoming, and blowing my feet off the pegs. I needed to absorb the energy on the downstroke, so I started increasing compression dampening a lot, and that was the answer, and it fixed everything. And I had gone a tremendous amount of valving, but I got it really good. And when I went back to the shop and dynoed it, the numbers went off the paper. And I was like, I would have never done this in the shop. You know, I would have never put that valve set in there and dynoed it and said, I'll try this. You know, I would have said, there's no way, this is way out of the realm of reality. But in reality, that's where we needed to be. And what I was testing before was way off. So that taught me that bench testing And as far as testing on machine dynos and stuff, that's pointless until you go out field testing and find something that works. Then that's what you should be bench testing.
So speaking of off the charts, it makes me think, like I said, huge readings and just stuff that if you based everything off numbers in a dyno, you may not think is feasible. I imagine when the sport started to head towards what looks like modern day Supercross, the settings that you guys had to have started developing at that time had to, in retrospect, not even retrospect, makes sense now, but at the time, looking at, I'm sure what you guys were doing then didn't totally make sense from what you were used to working on, or?
Well, again, the first time I made Supercross specific settings, I thought they were ridiculous. I didn't think they would work, and they worked quite well. And then I realized that you had to disregard what you knew about outdoor motocross for Supercross. It was like a whole different game. And so I think in the early days we were just basically running outdoor settings and making the spring a little stiffer, but we weren't increasing valving anywhere near where we are now. And again, that was a learning experience, and that was really trying, I don't like to use the term thinking out of the box, but I mean, it was like looking at something and going, I'm going to try this. I mean, it shouldn't work, but if this worked, then this should work. And that's how we found, stuff that's more towards modern Supercross stuff now. And, and justifiably, the more we were able to make the bike work good in those type of obstacles, the track design started to evolve into more and more challenging, ridiculous thing.
Yeah, once the track designers realized that the riders and the bikes were more incapable, it's like, what other crazy crap can we come up with?
Something even more hairy.
Hey, we're just taking a quick short break to thank, once again, the people that make this podcast happen and allow us to be able to talk to these cool guys and just kind of go forward with this program. The Inside Line is presented by Thor. Thor is celebrating 50 years of racing heritage, the first, the forever Thor Motocross. Also, we really want to thank Chaparral for their support, because for more than 30 years, Chaparral Motorsports has been sharing its love of dirt bikes with like-minded individuals by offering a massive selection of the latest riding gear, new models, parts and accessories, and great pricing on tires. Visit chapmoto.com. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conversation. What, who, that early Supercross era, who was some of the stuff, who were you testing with this with, and what were kind of the comments you guys were receiving?
Well, personally, I think when I was working with Suzuki, I was kind of limited to what I could do. I couldn't do some ridiculous setting that could hurt somebody or something like that. But the things that I think the biggest learning curve for me, and as far as developing what is now modern motocross, our Supercross type stuff, was when I was working basically with private riders, just doing things to kind of try to help them to set their suspension up to compete with the factory bikes. And I think probably the first guy I really came up with some which was to me revolutionary stuff, was Phil Lawrence, when he was on that Great Western Bank Kawasaki team, that private team, and so I could do whatever I wanted, and it worked quite well.
Like, what are you referring to? What was this, something you tried with him that was really...
It was valve style, changing what was in there and kind of changing the configuration or even the method of valving, and also not being afraid to go up on spring rate and not afraid to go down on spring rate or something like that, because we were working strictly with production bikes by then, and private team didn't have access to variable leverage rate, link ratios or anything like that. But the base bike was quite good, so just going testing and trying new ideas and stuff, it helped me learn. I think because I had a free hand at it, I wasn't afraid to try something that wouldn't work because I could take it out. But I was always afraid to do that if you were working with a factory team or something, you might get in trouble or something like that.
So earliest days of actually testing with teams, what was kind of stuff you guys would go through? Is it as simple as it started with, when you guys could actually break open the suspension? Was it oil weights and spring rates in the early days? At what point did it jump into the valving changes, and what were they?
It was valving and spring from the get-go, but even that late, which is the 90s, factory components were still pretty different than what was coming stock on the bikes. KYB always, their factory and their production stuff was always pretty closely related, because KYB's engineering department for production and factory is the same design group, so they share information a lot. But for example, the group that was doing, say, Yamaha factory and Kawasaki factory, it was quite a bit different than the production components.
Do you remember is there a standout to you part-wise? You remember getting an early pre-production part and being shocked at how close it was to, a factory version of that team, same part you're working on or manufacture, whether it be a fork or a shock a certain year, where you were just personally blown away that was making it to production?
The biggest shock for me was when Showa came out with the twin chamber fork design for production, because that type of design obviously was being used by Showa for several years, but KYB had a version of it that we were working with for various factory teams. But I thought there was no way that system would ever make it to production, because it was way too costly. And when Showa and Honda decided to make it a production component, that was shocking to me.
You were saying earlier about dealing with Roger and it kind of being just so much different than what the American riders you dealt with at the time, between their resourcefulness and what they were used to dealing with. Along the lines with all the riders you've gotten to work with past Roger's era, who do you feel like was the first, or any notable guys you came across later that reminded you of that you felt like they had either an extra step of resourcefulness or, understanding of bikes, chassis, suspension, just the way everything worked?
Well, the thing was, after Roger and then American riders kind of took over, were the best riders in the world. I always felt like the rider mindset then was always, I'm a racer, I'm a rider. I'm not supposed to know how to jet the carburetor or something like that. They were strictly riders, and they almost didn't have an interest in anything technical. They could tell you, oh, it's rich or it's lean or something like that, but none of them took an interest in that I worked with of, really tearing into the engine or tearing into anything technical. During that period of time, I worked a lot with, actually it was kind of later, but one of the riders that I worked with that was interested in developing and improving bikes was Bob Hanna. But by the time I started working extensively with him, he had passed his prime and he was working for Suzuki. When he worked at Yamaha and Honda, I didn't, especially at Honda, I think I just very little worked with him at Yamaha. But when he came to Suzuki, I worked with him a lot because that particular era was right when Hanna signed with Suzuki. It was the year that the production bike rule came into play. And so you could not make dramatic changes to the production bike. And so Bob became very heavily involved in trying to improve the production bike, you know, for himself and also for Suzuki. And he wasn't necessarily technical, but he was very good at giving feedback and comments. So I learned quite a bit working with him.
Now, Suzuki days, was this the Florida running back and forth from the hotel to the track with him trying to kill you guys?
Bob first started riding for Suzuki, and he was, as I said, he was kind of at the tail end of his competitive career, so he was, you know, he was a different guy than I think when he was competitive, but he was still a character.
What was, you mind tell someone? That one was pretty funny. You were, where were you guys?
Well, what it was is, the story was that I was in Florida doing pre-production bike testing with Bob, and we were there for everybody else rode Golden State Series, so you could stay in California and test and race and everything. But Hanna at the time always liked to race the Florida Series, and so I had to leave my home in holiday season and spend 3 weeks with Bob in Florida in a hotel and doing all the testing and racing. And it was really a tough time because they gave us the bikes and all the testing parts, but there was only me and his mechanic Jeff Clark and Bob. There were no engineers or race team managers or anything, and we were supposed to go set the bike up and get Bob happy in a relatively short amount of time. And so there was a test track at a really rough sand area called Croom, and Bob chose that to do a lot of testing at. And that particular track had a big open area that he had made a track. It was a real rough sand track, but the hotel we were staying at was it wasn't across the street, but it was the back parking lot to the hotel faced this big field. And so we had the box van set up in the parking lot, and we would work on the bikes there. And then we would jump in the rental car and we would drive out to the track, and Bob would test, and we'd get in and out of the car and make adjustments, and then go drive back to the hotel to make changes. And the observation that I made was Bob would be testing, and then the bike would swap or do something he didn't like, and he'd pull off and hold the bike wide open and ride at us and start screaming at us about how terrible everything was, and he would just be livid and yelling at us. And I mean, you know, we had to take it, and I would just listen and okay. And then we'd go back to the box van in the parking lot, and he'd come back and he would be calm, and And I thought, I just kind of made note of that. And then it seemed like when we were out at the track, I mean, I thought he wanted to beat me up or something. But then whenever we would be back at the hotel, he would be pretty calm. And then I had built some forks or something for him to try, and I said, okay, go try that. I'm going to build another set while you're out there. And so we did not go out to the track. And he rode, and he came back, and I thought, oh, he's going to scream at us. And when he got back to the parking lot, he goes, no, this is worse. This is worse than the last set. This is no good. But he was calm. It was a negative sample that he would have pissed him off, but he was calm when he told us. And I did it again, and the same thing happened. And so when he was out riding, I told Jeff, I said, you know what? I think when he rides, he's like angry or something. And so as soon as he gets off, stops, he's just mad. And so he starts screaming at us. And I said, but if we give him a chance to cool off when he's riding back, he's calmed down. He's not mad. So I said, we're not going out to the track anymore. We're just going to send him out there from here on in. So that's what we were trying to do, and it was working okay. And then finally, I put a shock on his bike or something, and he said, I want you to come out and watch me on this straightaway and tell me what the bike's doing. And I was like, no, just go ahead and come back and tell us how it's working. He goes, no, I really need you to watch us. So I said, okay. So me and Jeff got in the car and drove out there, and we were watching him ride, and he went down this straightaway, and the thing swapped, and he almost crashed, and I could see him looking over at us, and he just went off the track and just floored it over to where we were standing. And I said, oh, here he comes. And we jumped in the rental car and ran away from him, and he was chasing us down the road all the way back to the hotel, and we were laughing. And when we got there, he was just saying, why'd you guys run away from me? Why didn't you talk to me at the track? And I said, because you're a psycho. You get mad when you're on. And he denied it and everything, but it was for sure true.
Oh, I got one I got to play story-wise, have you explain, because this one cracks me up. Amongst the range of riders you could have ever dealt with, you got to meet Jason Lawrence. You got to work with Jason through the very prime of his career, but you also got to meet him at the very beginning at Lake Elsinore. What did he do? Did he blow up his bike, or what? He was on Scapovis.
No, he didn't have a bike or something, and it had rained, and Elsinore.
Parking lot always flooded.
Well, yeah, when it rained, there would be these huge lake puddles in the pits, and the track. I mean, if they worked on it, it was rideable, but the pits would be big lakes of water, and I was there in my box van, and this caravan of trucks came pulling in, and Sean Hamlin jumped out, and he said, oh, hi, Ross, I want you to meet my friend. And he says, Jason Lawrence. And I'd never met him before that, but I had heard all these stories about him knocking people down for fun on the track and stuff, so I thought he was a little jerk. And so he introduced me, and he just seemed like a long-haired kid. And then this Mercedes or something came pulling in too, and it was Scott Sepakovic, who was Jason's agent, and he was like the big movie star back then. He would always be wearing nice clothes out at the track and everything. And he came in and said, oh, Ross, Jason doesn't have a bike right now, so I'm going to let him ride my RM250 two-stroke. And can you adjust the suspension for Jason? And I said, well, no, you weigh 200 pounds. And Jason's like 130 or something. There's nothing I can do. I can soften it up, but the springs are too stiff. And he says, well, can't you just do something so he can ride it? And I said, no. And then Jason was standing there, and Jason said, no, it's all right. I don't care. I just want to ride it. And so we all suited up, and I was riding, and the track had big water puddles in it, but they had groomed the track so you could go around them and stuff. And somebody had said, "Oh, Jason Lawrence is out there splashing everybody, like just riding through the puddles and splashing people and stuff." And so I was back at my box van, and Jason came flying into the pits and threw the Suzuki on a box, and then he jumped in the box van with me, and he was going, "Don't say nothing, don't say nothing." And I was like, "Oh, what'd you do?" And then just then some fat vet rider rode up, and he was completely brown, covered with mud, and he's going, "Who was just riding this Suzuki? Who was just riding the Suzuki bike?" And he's looking at me, and I just kind of played dumb and didn't say nothing. And everybody else was just sitting there doing the same thing. And so finally he got really mad, and he just spun a donut and rode off. And Jason was giggling, and I go, "What'd you do?" And he goes, "Oh, I splashed that guy through a big water hole back there," and he was pissed off. And I was going, "You're a jerk," you know. But then a few minutes later, we're all just kind of sitting there, and this big 4x4 lifted truck comes backing up over kind of where we were, and he drives right into this giant water puddle, and then just floors it and does a big start and shoots mud and everything, water and rocks all over that RM250, and knocked it off the stand. And then he like rolled the window down and flipped us off and took off. And we all thought it was funny. We were laughing. But Scott Sevakovic was standing a few feet away on his cell phone. He was going, "What the fuck was that? Who was that guy?"
Oh, my word. It's actually funny. So you got to work with Jason a few years after that. I mean, what was your opinion on Jason for all the time you got to, like I said, I mean, you pretty much worked with him almost his whole extension of his career. He rode for your shop.
Well, he was just, you know, a super talented rider, but I had met a lot of riders that they just like to ride, but guys like that also would be like, they wouldn't train or do motos or anything. They'd go do a jump 1,000 times and whip it and stuff like that. And he didn't do that. He would just get on the bike, and he would just ride and just do these long motos and run out of gas and put more in and just keep riding. And he wouldn't be horsing around. He wasn't whipping it or doing anything silly like that. He was just riding. And I can remember going testing with him and putting something on his bike and saying, "Okay, try this." And then he'd go out, and then he would be out there like 10 laps, and I'd have to flag him in and go, "What are you doing? You know, come in." And I'd go, "Well, how was that?" You know, and I'd think, "Well, it's really good. That's why he kept riding." He would say, "Oh, this is no good." But he would still ride, and I was always puzzled by that. And so whenever we test, I had to insist to him, you know, don't stay out there for 20 laps or anything. But there were several days where he would test all day, and we would load up and get ready to go home, and he'd be loading his bike up, and he'd still be wearing his gear. And I'd go, "Oh, you know, what are you doing?" And he'd go, "Oh, I'm going to go to Star West or something, ride some more."
I remember seeing that. I'd show up at Star West or Paris in the afternoon. He'd show up still in his gear, get out, bike's dirty, he'd ridden all morning, and then he'd ride till 9 o'clock at night till like.
Yeah, he just loved to ride. But the other thing that I noticed about him when he raced, he was a very good racer, because like I would watch him, and if the guy in front of him went to the inside, he'd go to the outside. If they went to the outside, he'd go to the inside. He was always working the track. And he also had this thing that I used to notice about Jean-Michel Bayle, was he could go from a dead stop to like 80 miles an hour in like 10 feet. It was really weird. It's like usually someone who slows down for the inside would come out of the corner really slow, and someone on the outside would carry more speed. He would be able to go on the inside and immediately accelerate I don't know how, he was something in his riding style. And I never saw him go for an outside line and lose 10 bike lengths. I don't know. I never see that. He just had really good racecraft, I guess is the word for it. He was just really good at that.
Of course, nowadays you have your, after the years of working for KYB, you have your own shop, Enzo. So you're dealing with customers all the time, I think what's probably interesting is you probably have people calling you and being like, oh, I want to get the same thing Roxon has, or the same thing that Sealy runs and stuff. As we were talking about earlier, is just how much closer that's all come. I mean, you feel like you have a hard time explaining to people these days really how close the componentry has become between what Joe Blow buys on his brand new bike off the showroom floor versus the stuff that you still help develop with KYB today for race teams?
Well, it's not hard to explain. It's hard to convince, because you can tell someone this is the same thing that Ken Roxon has in his fork and shock. It's just made out of better materials, or there's some handmade parts. But it's design-wise, it's the same thing. People don't believe it. I probably wouldn't either. But it's people. They just don't believe that. They always think there's some huge mechanical advantage that these guys have over on them, and unfortunately, that's not the case.
Speaking of the shop, I mean, over the years, I'm thinking of a couple guys off the top of my head that you've done out of your garage at a shop saying you've had anywhere from just some kid helping you disassemble stuff to a couple employees, and you've been doing it long enough. You've had people come through here that have ended up in bigger positions around the industry, and you've also had some stories of kids I don't think have ever probably worked on anything or never involved in history. Some very I don't want to say sketchy, but some ridiculous sounding stories of some ex-employees. Does it ever surprise you, some of the guys you've had and where they've ended up, and who is like some notable guys that have come through your shop and worked for you?
Well, it's not surprising, because obviously what's the word you would say, probably a suspension guy, a young guy, his goal would be to work for, one of the main manufacturers, Showa, KYB, or WP, or something like that, to work at the manufacturing level. I did it the other way. I started there, and even though I'm still associated and working with KYB, I'm doing my own thing, doing a suspension shop that deals with the public. But each job has similarities and differences. Working with the public is probably a little more diverse, and I won't say it's more difficult, but the difference is when you're working for a race team or something, you're dealing with 3, maybe 4 guys, sometimes 1 or 2, and you may do something with them dramatically radical and they like it, but that isn't something that you can apply to production suspension or for the average rider. So it's like both jobs requires an open mind for sure, but I think you're dealing with a much more diverse crowd with production, because I mean, we get guys that lead you in a direction you're just thinking there's no way, and then they love it, and then they do well with it. So who's to say that's wrong? So for me, it's like the guys that I trained or something that went on to work for different teams. I think you learn the most when you're testing, when you're going out and you're trying something and the rider gives you instant feedback. That's when you learn the most, because you're not doing something for a rider and giving it to him and he comes back 2 weeks later and says it's no good. You're getting instant results. So that's where I feel you tend to learn the most. And a lot of the guys that came through the shop, that was where they did their learning, is once they left and were working with race teams or something like that.
So last one, and we'll get out of here for the evening. So over the years, what the big jumps have been in suspension technology or design? Have you felt like it's always been clear to see ahead of what suspension was going to do when, like, let's say, twin cartridge forks are going to monoshocks and just these jumps? Do you feel like from what you guys worked on with racing, you always knew 5-10 years down the road what you thought production suspension would look like? And then following up that, looking at where we're at today, do you think there's a clear road of where suspension's going to go, or do you think it's still kind of up in the air what we're going to be riding on in 5 years from now?
It's whatever you're working with at the time. I mean, for sure, I've been working on stuff where I'll go, this isn't as good as what we had 2 years ago. I mean, that's going to happen. But generally speaking, at the factory level and even pre-production level, you have an idea of, okay, we're going to eventually go to this system or we're going to go to that system. But in recent times, I won't say we went backwards, but in recent times, there's certainly been times where we tested something and it doesn't work as well, or it does work well, and that's what we go with. And then a couple years down the road, we end up comparing it to the old system again and going, no, this works better, and we go back. So from the standpoint of seeing into the future, it's going to take the next generation of development before you can see that, but it always comes.
Do you think, because I look right now just in mountain bike technology, albeit they're trying to accomplish a different job with these systems, stuff with like inertia valves and electronics where they are trying to close off, valves for climbing and stuff, but still they're using either mechanical or electronical forces to radically change the valving force by either completely shutting it off or changing it for a climbing mode. And some people look at street bikes where they have full electronics, but I think the hard part of street is always that the ground is so consistent. Do you think any of those types of technologies can play into what motocross is, or do you feel like it's so specialized with the terrain changing and riders' different forms that those systems can't be applied properly? Or
well, I think, from what you've just said, it's more the requirements of what they're asking the component to do. I mean, we don't ever see any kind of obstacle or requirement of the suspension that, we have to have the shock locked out right now. I mean, we don't have any requirements like that. But I'm sure electronics and different stuff will make their way into it, but really all the stuff I've seen to date for the future is all, I expect to look at it and see something that goes way over my head. But 9 times out of 10, it'll be something, this is an electronic adjustment system or something where instead of turning a clicker, you push a button or something. So to me, it's not, they're not developing anything that's going to take over what we have right now soon that I've seen.
Cool. Well, let's get out of here for the evening. It's getting late. Thanks, man.